Okay, here we are back again in the book of Daniel tonight. Last week we covered I could say last week, a few days ago, Tuesday, sorry, we covered Daniel chapter 1. And something that I didn't mention right at the end of chapter 1 is we have this really interesting bookend that takes place. So the chapter 1 of Daniel begins with Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, right? And talking about the year of his reign. And he was the last king in Jerusalem when the exile began. And chapter 1 ends with, and then Daniel, by the way, he continued on in the court of Babylon all the way up to the coming of Cyrus. And so that period from when Nebuchadnezzar first laid siege to Jerusalem and the first wave of exiles came out of Judea into Babylon until Cyrus. And if you'll remember, Cyrus then is the Persian king that will come in later, and it'll be Cyrus who God uses to kind of open the doors up to allow the Jewish people that have been in exile to finally start making their way back to the land of Israel. And so right in the very first chapter, and giving us these two little tidbits of information, the author of this book is telling us, where this story in the bigger picture of the story of the Bible, where this story sits in the story of God's people and the history of Israel, and that it's sitting exactly in this about 70-year period between the beginning of the exile and the first return of this remnant out of Babylon back to Jerusalem. Why does that matter? Well, it sort of sets it up. If chapter 1 is sort of preparing us for what we're about to read and the stories that we're about to read, that's sort of laying in our minds, okay, this is a story about, living in exile. It's a story that encompasses this long period of forced exile of God's people, not being where they should be, not living and dwelling in the land that was promised to them, the land that was supposed to be their rest, the land that was supposed to be their blessing, their inheritance. All of that has been taken away, and they are in exile. And the book of Daniel is showing us a portrait of what it looks like to be a faithful Israelite in the midst of exile. If chapter 1 has set us up for anything, is to expect that Daniel is a man of faith, that he is a man willing to only allow the assimilation that's being forced upon the Israelites as a people. He'll allow the assimilation up to a point, but there was a line in the sand when it comes to his own personal purity. He refuses to allow himself to be defiled by Babylon. Certain things, like even down to the receiving a new name, and presumably we'll see, that they dress like Babylonians, they learn to talk like Babylonians, they get jobs in the government of Babylon, all of these things, but he refuses to allow his identity to become Babylonian, which is super relevant, has continued to be relevant for God's people through successive generations that have read this book, read these stories. We find ourselves, it seems, constantly in this tension as followers of the God of the Bible, to how do we live in this world but not be totally assimilated into it. Where do we draw the boundary lines where we can continue to function in society but at the same time remain distinct, to be not conformed, as the Apostle Paul writes in Romans, to this world, but live a transformed life, live a life that stands out from the lives of our neighbors, to live a life that might seem countercultural. And in fact, one of the questions that the book of Daniel grapples with is what's the role between the culture that we find ourselves in and how that defines us, and what it means to be people that belong to Yahweh, the God of the Bible, and how do those two things speak to one another? Is the God of the Bible just totally opposed to human culture? Can we, transform? Are we supposed to transform human culture? Are we supposed to separate from human culture? All of these things are questions that this book is addressing and inviting us to wrestle with alongside Daniel and his friends. So, chapter 2 is a super long chapter, and so there's so much more I'd love to say, but I feel like we got to jump into it if we're going to get through it tonight. So, all right. The first verse of chapter 2, if you are a careful reader, can seem super confusing because it begins with, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, wait a second. If this is in the second year and Nebuchadnezzar has already besieged Jerusalem, he's taken captives back, Daniel and his friends are some of those captives, and they've gone through this 3-year training period to prepare them to serve and work in the court of Babylon. But now it's the second year. So did we go back in time? Is this taking place, before that? And if so, then it becomes really confusing. As we'll see later when Daniel comes into the story, like this can't be from before because Daniel already seems to have a position in the Babylonian court. So what's up with that? A couple things. It's an odd way to phrase that this is in his second year, but the way that Babylonians, the Babylonian monarchy would sort of count their years is you'd have the initial year that the new king took his throne, and that's sort of the ascension year, and then successive years after that would then be like the first year of his reign would be the next year after that, and then the second year. So this could technically be like about 3-ish years into Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Well, if that's the case, why word it this way? Doesn't the author know this could be confusing to people, especially if they're not used to the way that Babylonians count their years? Yeah, probably. But by phrasing it this way, the author is hyperlinking or pointing back to another story in the Bible that takes place after a 2-year period of something. And I mentioned last week how there in the first chapter of Daniel, there were some links back to Genesis and the story of Joseph, particularly Genesis 39 and a little bit in 41. Well, now you're going to see a lot of hyperlinks and connections between what we read in Daniel chapter 2 and what we see with Joseph and Pharaoh and Pharaoh's dreams back in Genesis 41. In fact, if you're not watching this live, watching this at a later time here on YouTube, I would highly recommend you pause right now and go back and read Genesis 41 and then come back and follow along with Daniel 2, and just wow, you'll notice so many connections. So anyway, the first one is in this very first verse, is that Genesis 41 begins with 2 years later into Joseph being in prison and all of this. And so that beginning these two stories with that 2 years into something is just immediate, quick. If you're really familiar with the Joseph story, and if you love the Torah, why wouldn't you be? Or you're thinking about dreams and kings, and especially pagan kings who have authority over Israelites and sort of enslave them, then the correlation becomes really tight. So the second year reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and it says his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. And that where it says his spirit was troubled, is literally the same phrase in Hebrew that is used to describe Pharaoh's sleep in Genesis 4. And so just another one, just like the author is quickly, just in rapid succession, throwing us all these tight connecting points between these two stories. The author of Daniel wants us to understand this story in light of Genesis 41. Why is that? Well, we'll get to that. Okay, so then the king commanded that the magicians, and again, sorry, I keep pausing, but it's almost funny. So like the word that the ESV translates as magicians, and you might have other words there, is a fairly rare word in the Hebrew Bible. It really only appears in the story with Pharaoh in Genesis 41, and then again in Pharaoh's court in Exodus, I think 8 and 9. It's, if you remember that scene when Moses is sort of confronting the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh has his own kind of magicians, right? Who, oh, you can do tricks, Moses, we can do tricks too. Those guys, right? It's used to describe those guys. And then here in Daniel 2. And just besides Daniel, that short bit in Exodus and Genesis 41, those stories, outside of that, story isn't used anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. Think that's significant? Yeah, so it's again just tying these stories tightly together. Okay, so he summons the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans, who were known to be into all this stuff, all of the above, to be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. And so far, it seems very similar to that Joseph story, right? King has a dream, doesn't understand it, calls in his dream interpretation experts to explain to him what the dream is and what it means. Okay. And the king says to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Now that's sort of an interesting way to phrase it, and sort of suggests, implies maybe, that either Nebuchadnezzar doesn't actually remember his dream, except that he knows that it really bothered him, or that he doesn't remember it in full. The implication is there that it could, or at least the door's open. It's ambiguous. I'll say that it's ambiguous. And so then the Chaldean said to the king in Aramaic, and that's a cute little thing that it says, and they said it in Aramaic. And if you're actually reading this in the original text, this is where the language transition begins. So up until this point, we would have been reading the text in Hebrew. And then right after that, when it says, and then they said to the king in Aramaic, everything after that is in Aramaic. Not just what they say, but the whole narrative just totally switches over to being a story in Aramaic. And it continues in Aramaic all the way to the end of chapter 7, which, if you remember from last week, it's really, chapters 2 through 7 that form this really tight chiasm, this symmetrical flow, this mirroring of the story, of the details and scenes in the story. And all of that just happens to be, except for these first few verses, in Aramaic. Interesting. And you think about how what that says about the intended audience, the original audience, we'll say, of the book of Daniel. There are not really any other books in the Bible. I mean, there's a few that have a little bit of Aramaic in them, like Ezra, but Daniel really is set apart in that half the book is written in one language and half the book in the other, which presumes that the people reading it are bilingual. Think about that there's a book in the Bible that actually presumes a bilingual audience. And then you think about what that would mean for that audience to be familiar with both Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, and the Hebrew that's in Daniel is uses a lot of words specifically from the Torah. So it's actually more like Old Hebrew words. And so it presumes an audience that's familiar with biblical Old Hebrew, and then also an audience that at the same time speaks what would have been sort of the language of the empires of Mesopotamia, that would include Babylon, obviously, and then also the kingdoms and the nations that would follow after Babylon, all the way up until the time of Jesus, the time of Christ. Aramaic continued to be the major regional language of this whole area, including Israel, the land of Israel. And so when you think about languages, and I grew up bilingual, and you actually have to think differently to speak a different language. Languages carry with them their own grammar and syntax and all of that, and even how you word things, what nouns might have gender to them, male, female, gender to even inanimate objects, and all of those things can be different from one language to another, and that sort of causes you to see the world differently when you speak that language. The language brings with it almost a cultural worldview or lens with it when you speak that language. And so here's a book that when you're reading it, particularly if you're reading it out loud, which I believe that the Bible is actually is meant and written to be something that is read and recited out loud. When you're reading this, it's almost, there's a point in the story where the way that it's written forces you to sort of switch tracks in your brain and start thinking differently. Now you're out of the traditional Hebrew worldview mindset, and now you're in the land of Gentiles. Now you're in the language of the nations that traditionally have oppressed Israel and continue to oppress Israel for the rest of its lifetime, up until it was destroyed for a time by Rome. And so just think about that as you're reading the rest of this all the way through 7, that we're meant to be sitting in the mindset of the nations, rather than, even as we are following Hebrew characters and sort of their adventures, if you will, as strangers in a strange land. So I've said a lot just to say that this is significant. It's not a minor footnote that, we changed languages here. Like, something significant has happened in the story and the telling of the story. And let's try to pay attention to that and ponder the meaning behind that. Okay. So what do they say? What are the first words in Aramaic? O King, live forever. Which, you read very many stories about kings in the ancient Near East, and that always seems to be the proper way to always start any sentence when you're addressing the king. You'll see that repeated in lots of other stories. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. And the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation. So this is super unusual, as the story will continue to tease out for us bit by bit. That normally, when the king summoned his wise men, his sages, to his best dream interpreters, like, this isn't normally how it goes. Normally, he gives the details of a dream. If it's obvious stuff, they give an obvious interpretation. If there's, more hidden, enigmatic symbolism, whatever, they have books and things, scrolls that they would go and consult. What does this image mean? Or what does it mean if you have a yellow dog under a cloudy sky, that kind of thing. And usually as part of those rituals too, they'd have things where they would go and, burn incense and go through various rituals to sort of appeal to their gods, for wisdom and understanding these things. But you always need, you need data to come up with the interpretation. You can't interpret a dream that you've never heard before, or at least that's never been asked before. And that's what he's asking now. And not only is he asking that, he's basically saying, and if you can't do it or you get it wrong, you're dead. Like, somebody woke up on the wrong side of the bed this morning. Like, he is really disturbed by this dream. And we, as the readers of this story, this is meant to hook us in and really cause us to wonder, like, what kind of a dream has he had that he is that disturbed by it. He is that troubled by it, that if he can't get the meaning of it and know for sure that the meaning is the right meaning, it's the right interpretation, then kill all the wise men. Like, wow, that's pretty extreme. And, if we read the story of Esther, which, we was the series right before this one on Daniel, we've talked about, these portraits of all powerful Gentile rulers who their reign and rule isn't safe. Like, it doesn't feel safe to live in an empire where the king can wake up one day not liking his dreams, and now people are going to die. Like, that's serious. That's frightening, right? And it makes us, I said this a lot when we were studying Esther, it makes us yearn for a king that's not like that, that's not impulsive and erratic and dangerous in this way. Okay, so what did his servants say? They answered a second time and said, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation." They're just like, they're not going with it because they know what he's asking is crazy. Verse 8, the king answered and said, "I know with certainty that you are trying to gain time." Actually, literally, which I'm disappointed in the ESV, because for once, like the English idiom matches perfectly the literal idiom in the Aramaic. What he actually says is, "I know you're trying to buy time. You're trying to buy time with this. Because you see that the word from me is firm. If you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the times change. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation." So basically he's letting him know. He set up a test. Because if he tells them the dream, how does he know that the interpretation that they are giving him is actually true, that they're not just making it up? But anybody that can tell you what you dreamed has obviously got connections to real spiritual insights. They've got a direct line to the gods or what have you, whatever you believe in that dreams might come from. Like, that's sort of proof that they're tapped into the truth of the matter. And so that's the test he set up. It's easy for anybody, if you tell them your dream, to give you an interpretation, whether it's right or not. Who's going to be the judge of that? But it's impossible for someone to tell you what your dream is, or it should be, unless, again, they have connections to higher powers. And so he's testing his wise men to see how wise they really are. Okay, so verse 10, the Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand. For no great and powerful king has asked for such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, to put it mildly, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh." In other words, they're saying, hey, only the gods could answer that, and they're not here. Like, they don't live here. They're far away. The only people you have here are mere humans, and no mere human could do what you're asking. So how does the king respond to this very reasonable, logical, rebuttal? "Because of this, the king was angry and very furious, and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed." Now, up until this point in this little side story, it's all odd. Like, what is this about? This is weird. We might have spotted some connections to the Joseph story, which might be a clue to us that Daniel's going to get involved in this in short order. But really beyond that, if you're not even thinking along those lines, like, this is just a story about wicked pagan king and his wicked, magic practicing pagan court, and why do we as Israelites, as followers of Yahweh, like, why do we even care about this story? Oh, now we see it's significant, but because of the actions of this king and stuff going on that's totally has nothing to do with them personally. Who's about to be killed if all the wise men in Babylon are going to be killed? Well, we just read in the last chapter who are now among that number. Well, Daniel and three of his friends, and presumably also any others young Jews that might have been promoted into this same position. And so now, through no fault of their own, they are now being threatened by a crazy edict from a crazy king. Does this have any parallels with the Esther story? Absolutely. And so again, just like in the Esther story, like what in the world is, like, we need divine intervention to put a stop to this craziness, right? Verse 13, so let's see what's going to happen. The suspense is building. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed. And they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them, right? Because they're part of this group of wise, people have literally a position in his administration, like of the wise men, the sages. So then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, or the chief executioner, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree of the king so urgent? Like, why? What? Just is it okay to know, like, why suddenly we all have to die? And Arioch made the matter known to Daniel. And Daniel went in and requested the king appoint a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. Now, it can be easy to read that as that he went and had a conversation with Nebuchadnezzar, but we'll see in a little bit that clearly hasn't happened yet. And so what does it mean that he went in and then requested the king? So clearly he went in to the office, so to speak, went from home to the office and put in a formal request that eventually reached the king, saying, hey, I can do this, but I'm going to need some time. Interestingly, the king says, okay. Now, why does the king say okay to this, but not okay to the other guys? Like, unclear. The story just continues to move on. And so we're left to feel like clearly the same kind of favor that was on Daniel in chapter 1, that when he was required to eat of foods that he felt would defile him, and he asked for permission to be given time to show that it would be okay for him to eat the other, the food that was clean to him. And then that all was allowed, and he passed the test, and then it became like, great, you can eat whatever you want from now on, Daniel. That same kind of favor, which we saw in chapter 1, was clearly God's favor, God's hand with him, still seems to be operating in him. All right, verse 17. Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Again, very similar to that Esther story, where Esther sort of determines, like, this is the course of action, this is what I've got to do if the people of Israel are going to be spared. I need to pray and fast, though it doesn't actually say pray in Esther. For you, go back and watch Esther if you want to know why that is. But implicitly to pray and fast, right, for 3 days. And not just Esther, but she invites Mordecai and the other Jews in the city to join her in praying and fasting for God's intervention. And so we have that similar portrait here where Daniel is going to seek the counsel, the inspiration, the revelation from the Lord his God, but he wants more intercessors joining him for that. So he invites his faithful Jewish friends to join him in asking God to rescue them from an annihilation by seeking the mercy of the God of heaven. Okay, so verse 19. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. So then Daniel blessed the God of heaven, and Daniel answered and said. And so hopefully, whatever translation of the Bible you're reading, like this next part is either indented, set apart, space around it, whatever, than how it normally is. And the reason is because at this point, Daniel breaks into song. If you didn't know the book of Daniel was a musical, well, congratulations, now you know. And so this is all Aramaic poetry, much in the form of the Psalms. but with an interesting twist to how the Psalms usually go. Normally in the Psalms, especially Psalms that sort of mirror the context of the song that Daniel sings here to God. Normally, how it works is the psalmist will begin with sort of thanksgiving, giving to God for delivering him, give testimony to what God has done, and praising him for that. And then we'll transition from that place to a place of just worshiping God for his attributes, and just who he is, worshiping God for his identity and who he is. That's the normal flow of a psalm like this in the book of Psalms. Daniel actually goes at it from the opposite angle. He actually begins with simply worshiping God for who he is, and then praising and giving testimony for what God has done, which is an interesting way to frame it. And it's not like one way's right and one way's wrong, but in doing that, it to me, as I read the poem, and I encourage you to reflect on this yourself, and with your family, but beginning with God's identity and then flowing from there, worshiping God for who he is, and then from there begin thanking him for what he has done, I feel like creates a more solid, like, cause and effect relationship between the two, where what God does for Daniel is recognizing in the song. It flows from who God is. God's done what he's done because of who he is, because of his identity. That's just my take on it. Again, yeah, read it, think about it, pray about it. But let's read it. Let's read his song. Blessed be the name of God forever and ever. And side note, whenever you see, people talking about a name, whether it's God's name or a person's name in Middle Eastern thought, your name is synonymous with your identity, with your character, with your attributes, right? So when he's saying, he's not just blessing God's name because it sounds cool, or he likes the spelling. He's, by blessing God's name, he's saying, I'm blessing all the essence of who you are, God. I'm blessing your identity. To whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. And then from there, switches back to narrative, verse 24. Therefore Daniel went in to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation. This is really interesting, and this is a theme that we see often in the scriptures. Daniel and his friends, their lives are on the line. They are about to be put to death. They cry out to God. God answers and brings them deliverance, brings them salvation. But notice how, and Daniel seems very aware of this, the salvation of Daniel and his friends now becomes the salvation of all these pagan magicians and soothsayers. Isn't that interesting that the blessing that God pours out on God's people overflows to include people that are not part of Daniel's group? Now, that doesn't mean that they don't need to change their ways and repent and all of that. Not at all. But this is a theme that often people get blessed simply by being in proximity to the people of God. And that is often, in many of these stories, meant to be a signpost, not glorifying Daniel or his friends, as we'll see this whole book makes really clear. It's about glorifying their God. It's about glorifying the God of the Bible, who's the God of Israel, who is the God of Daniel and his friends, and meant to by drawing them into the shadow of the blessing, it's meant to invite them into that same community to which the blessings are pouring down. Super, super cool. And just, just a quick little thing that's in there that we could easily skip over. So verse 25, then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and thus said to him, I have found among the exiles from Judah a man who will make known to the king the interpretation. And the king declared to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, because obviously he wasn't going to call him Daniel, are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation? And Daniel answered the king and said, and you think of all the different ways that he could, now that he knows it, the information we know has already been revealed to him. We, the audience, are still waiting with bated breath to hear what was this dream about, right? And Daniel could come in and totally take credit, right? And yeah, I am, and watch what I'm about to do. Watch what he says. No wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. It's interesting because actually what Nebuchadnezzar's wise men and magicians had said earlier was actually true. What they said is really only the gods or some higher power could actually give the king what he's asking for. They were right about that, but then they were wrong when they said, and they're not around here, and you can't find a being like that'll talk to us the way you want. Actually, no. What Daniel's saying, no, you're wrong. There is a God, not gods, but a God who can do what the king wants, and actually he does. As to contradict what the wise men, the Chaldeans, said, he does dwell with flesh. He does live and abide with his people, and he's the one that's actually. I'm just the messenger. That's what Daniel's saying. I'm just the messenger for what God actually has to say to you right now. So here's what it is: your dream and the visions of your head, as you lay in bed, are these. To you, O king, as you lay in bed, came thoughts of what would be after this. And he who reveals mysteries made known to you what is to be. And I want to point out what part of what the author is doing here is helping us to understand that this dream that Nebuchadnezzar has is not just some random dream. It's not some random revelation of the future that God has sent him. The context, we want to keep all this stuff in Daniel, which especially has stuff that we're going to read bleeds into eschatology and study of the end times and all of this. We want to make sure that we're dealing with all of these dreams and visions and symbols and all of these things in their proper context, and that we make sure that the text, what the text says is what the text says, and that we don't go beyond the text, and that whatever is said has to fit and apply to at the surface level to the original audience and to its original context fully and completely before we then take it and start applying it to other events beyond the text. The text can mean more than what it's saying, but it can't mean less, and we want to make sure that we don't rob the text of what it's actually saying. And so Nebuchadnezzar is thinking about not just the future, he's thinking about his future, his kingdom's future, the legacy of his kingship and his kingdom and all of those things. That's the context for this dream. He's wondering, I have all of this glory and power. I've achieved so much. What's going to happen to it ultimately? His advisors and noblemen are always greeting him with, "Oh, king, live forever," right? But he knows at the end of the day, even though he styles himself as a god among men, he knows he is going to die, that he's not going to live forever. And he's wondering about what's going to happen, not just to him and his legacy, but to all that he has built and all that he might ever build. That's the context of this dream. Let's keep that in mind as we go forward. Verse 30. But as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living, but in order that the interpretation may be known to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your mind. This is ultimately, this dream is about revealing to Nebuchadnezzar what's in his own heart. It's ultimately about exposing this all-powerful king to a moment of vulnerability and humility before the presence of the Almighty God, who we'll see is the real king. Okay, verse 31. So now he goes into the interpretation, or actually goes into the dream itself. You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. And I want to say, what it says clay there, if you're thinking like soft clay that you're molding things with, there's another word for that in Aramaic. The word that's used here means clay that's been fired. So it's like pottery clay that's hard. So brittle, right? Fragile, but not soft and mushy like you might think of clay. Okay, verse 34. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces and became like chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. I can only imagine, like, the face of Nebuchadnezzar is just like, wow, like, that was exactly my dream. And like, you'll notice here how good the interpretation is, that actually as Daniel begins to interpret, he begins to share details about the dream that actually aren't in the dream. And that's not cheating. That's what divinely inspired dream interpretation looks like, is that Daniel's given insight not just to the things that Nebuchadnezzar sees, but things that are happening sort of behind the scenes in the dream itself. And I want to pause there. If you're someone who's familiar with the stories in the Hebrew Bible, and you've heard this dream so far, is there anything so far in the story before Daniel interprets it that might start popping into your mind as you're reading this description? Will you think about images and large images like this? You think about the idolatry of the Canaanites and the Egyptians, and now obviously the Babylonians. Of course, there's this big giant image idol type thing, and you look at the four metals, and that sequence of four metals appear numerous times in the book of Joshua. And all four, like, we have different relationships with some of these metals in the 21st century than they did 2,500 years ago. But back then, all of these metals would have been precious for certain applications. They all had value to them. Iron had value to it. Bronze had value to it. The value of iron and bronze was different than the value of gold and silver, but they still had value and purpose to them. So, okay, there's that side of it. The fired clay mixed with the iron is a bit odd. And then you think about this thing, how enormous it is, and how it's like this giant thing. And then you see in the picture of the dream, this stone come hurtling towards it. Now, is there a story in the Bible where you have a massive giant who is taken out by what looks like a small stone? Oh yeah, that's David, right? I wonder if this dream has anything to do with David or a type of David. But then you see that the opposite happens from what you would expect. Like, you'd expect, like the David Goliath imagery, like the stone should strike the head and then the whole thing comes crashing down. But instead, it does the opposite. It strikes the feet, and the whole thing comes crashing down. Odd. Why? What does that mean? What is that implying? Well, now we really want to hear the interpretation. So verse 37, you, O king, and look how Daniel addresses Nebuchadnezzar. You, O king, the king of kings. Whoa. To whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom and the power and the might and the glory. Does that sound like the end of the Lord's Prayer? Like Daniel, on the one hand, is addressing Nebuchadnezzar like a human god, which is actually how Nebuchadnezzar and other kings of this time period, and the ones to follow him, would have styled themselves, right, as living gods. In fact, they would call themselves the sons of the gods. And Daniel seems to be addressing him as if that is the case, and yet he also, in the midst of that, says, actually, the true God, the God of heaven, is actually the one who's given you all of this. Whatever semblance of divinity that you're operating in, it's actually all a gift and at the permission of the true God who's the God of heaven. Okay. Verse 38, and into whose hand he has given, wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, making you rule over them all. So wait, so Nebuchadnezzar is ruling over the birds? What's up with that? Well, again, is there a place in the Bible that talks about human beings and relationship to images and has to do with ruling over the birds of the air and the beasts of the field? Yeah. Page 1 of the Bible, right? Genesis 1:26, where it talks about how mankind was created in the image, as to be an image of the Almighty Creator God, and immediately defines for us a part of what that means. To be the image of God means is being given the gift of authority to reign and rule over the beasts of the field and the birds of the air. And so in a way, how Daniel is addressing Nebuchadnezzar, said, from a certain point of view, Nebuchadnezzar, you look exactly like what humans were always supposed to be. Reigning and ruling with power and authority from God, reflecting God's own power and authority out into the world, right? Of course, we know that because of human sin and humans seizing for themselves the ability to determine for themselves in their own eyes what was good and what was evil, and therefore cutting themselves off from God and from his life, right? That whole side of humanity has gone horribly wrong, and now whatever power and authority we're given seems to corrupt us thoroughly. And that's what we see totally on display in this story with Nebuchadnezzar, right? And yet, behind that all, there is a picture of something that does harken back to God's original intention for humanity. And that seems to be acknowledged here, right? And so Daniel goes on to say, you are the head of gold. You, Nebuchadnezzar. Let's not read into more than what the text says. He doesn't say your empire is the head of gold. He says you are the head of gold. That's what the head of gold represents. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you. So you've been wondering in your evening hours, what's going to be your legacy? What's going to come after you? He's like, another kingdom, and it's going to be worse, or at least inferior to what you are. And yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks into pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these. And as you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom. But some of the firmness of iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with the soft clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, So the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. And as you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will mix with one another. Now the ESV says in marriage, and that's partly because the wording in the Aramaic is odd and enigmatic, and translators always want to try to clear up ambiguity and make it clear for readers, and so they're taking their best stab at what this actual phrase means. What it actually says there is not that they shall be mixed in marriage. The word marriage isn't in the text, but it says they will mix human seed. What does that mean? Doesn't explain. It just goes on. Just as iron, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain. Now here's like a detail we didn't have before. The stone wasn't just come out of nowhere. It was a stone that was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. A great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation sure. So essentially, and if we're not reading anything more than that, than what it's saying, and we can pretend that we haven't read the rest of the book yet, and we don't know about other dreams and visions that can maybe be correlated to this, but we'll talk about that when we get to those. So far in the story, this is all we know. Nebuchadnezzar is stressing out over what's going to happen after him, what's going to happen to his kingdom, what's going to happen to his legacy, his lineage, right? And what he's told is, there's going to be other kings after you, and they're going to be different. And some of them are going to be inferior to you. Some of them are going to be maybe stronger. But ultimately, none of them are going to last. And even the strongest one of all is going to have an inherent fragility mixed into it. And despite its own best efforts to make itself stronger or shore up its own weaknesses, it actually has sown the seeds of its own destruction. And the very place where it's tried to establish its own foundation, its own solidity, is the place that it's going to be struck. And that vulnerability, that fragility is going to be totally exposed, and the whole thing is going to be destroyed. And not only that, not only this fourth kingdom, but everything that came before it is just wiped out as if it was nothing. And when we see language like this isn't unusual language, this idea of a kingdom that's coming, that's going to be established, that is forever, that wipes away into dust and ashes what came before, that's a kingdom of God, that belongs to God, that will never be taken away from God's people. All of that is super messianic language. And even down to having it being represented by a rock and by a mountain. I mean, that just brings into, going back to Exodus, the Exodus story, and the rock from which God watered his people. It goes all the way through, into the prophets and the Psalms, and talking about the God of Israel as the rock of Israel, as the mountain refuge, the mountain fortress of his people, all of these things, right? And so what's clear from this dream is you might be great and powerful, Nebuchadnezzar, and you might have all this authority, and you might be like unto a god to your subjects, and yet you will pass away. The kings that come after you, great as they might be, will pass away. The destiny of wicked human authority is to be annihilated and be destroyed by the coming of God's future kingdom that will replace all of these. As the mountain grows, the rock that shatters grows to become a mountain that fills the whole earth. It's not even just looking forward to a time when the nation of Israel is restored. This is a global messianic kingdom that is being promised and is totally at the initiative of God himself. God's the one that does it. It's not as if something happens in the dream that sort of provokes God to do this or invites God to do this. God takes the initiative, breaks through into human history, wipes out what's come before, and establishes his own kingdom. And you think about the message of that, without speculating into what the different metals and kingdoms and kings represent, and trying to label all those things, that we can get so off what the main point of the dream and its interpretation is, which is to speak a word of comfort to the people of God living in exile, looking at the crazy world they find themselves in, maybe even a world that seems to be getting increasingly worse as each successive regime brings about worse violence and wickedness and sin upon the earth, and wondering, is there any hope? Where is God? What's he going to do? Does he notice? Does he care? And we see absolutely he does. All his promises are yes and amen. And the things that he has spoken of previously through the prophets, he will fulfill. And there's nothing the mightiest human empires in the world can do to stop God even for a moment. And that should be encouraging to us. Obviously, it was an encouragement to Daniel and his friends in the successive generations after Daniel. And to us as Christians in the 21st century should read this, and regardless of the craziness happening in our world right now, this should comfort us. The worst things that are going on the planet will have an end date. God will put a stop to all of this, to sickness, to death, human misery and suffering and exploitation. All of that injustice has an end date to it, and God himself will see it through. That is so encouraging. So, all right, how does this story end in chapter 2? Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel, and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. This, by the way, though it seems like a little crazy and over the top response, is actually fulfillment of words spoken by Isaiah and other prophets about how even though you get carried off into exile and it seems like you're subjugated and defeated and all of these things, and yet pagan kings will fall before your feet and acknowledge you are the people of God. And that's exactly what's happening here. The king answered and said to Daniel, "Truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery." Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. But Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained at the king's court. So the king offers him, just to sum that up real quick, king offers him, total authority over the province and administratively, which is a lot like, again, like the Joseph story. And Daniel actually steps back and says, actually, no, I'm happy just being over the wise men and all of that, the counselors. But my three friends, these guys would be great administrators, promote them into that role, which is exactly what happens. And that'll come in with the next story this coming Tuesday in chapter 3. And we'll see that. And so you remember there's this interesting in chapter 1 dichotomy, difference, distinction. That's what a word I'm looking for. There's this distinction made between Daniel and his three friends, where it talks about how they were really skilled at, the book learning of the Babylonians and mastering their language and literature and all of that. And it says, and Daniel was really good at the whole dream interpretation and getting visions from God. That was really his specialty. And his three friends, their specialty was really in the administration stuff and really in the understanding and duplicating the literature of the Babylonians. And I talked about last week how in the Q&A when we talked about who wrote the book of Daniel, that I thought there was a clue in the text. And I think this is, again, a clue in the text where Daniel himself is yeah, leave me to the dream interpretation. My three friends, these guys are brilliant at administration and at writing. So that to me is a clue as to who could have had a hand in collecting these stories. I do think, Daniel obviously wrote the things that say, "Hey, I, Daniel, blah blah blah," but someone could have collected those things, gathered them together, organized them, edited them, cleaned up the language to make it the really compelling and exciting story that it is written to be. So that's Daniel chapter 2. Let's jump over to the YouTube live chat and see if there's any thoughts, questions that we can go into before wrapping up. So there's a question about Abraham. Was Abraham a Chaldean? So the first of all, what does it mean to be Chaldean? And it's actually interesting when you talk about like the dating of the book of Daniel. There's some people that say, well, because this word Chaldean is used so often in the book, that this is actually a late word, and therefore wasn't even being used at the time of Daniel and his friends. But other scholars have shown that that's a pretty hasty thing to say. And we actually don't have any real evidence of that it could have been used a lot earlier than that. But what does it mean to be Chaldean? It's a bit different. Chaldea is a particular province within the modern day nation of Iraq. And this is that same region of modern day Iraq that Abraham and his family originated from before they began traveling west towards the land that was promised to him. And so is he a Chaldean? If you mean, is he from this same general region where Daniel and his friends now find himself, then yes, he is. Is he a Babylonian? Well, then you got to get into the lineages of, everyone who, remember, Abraham's story begins right after we've had the whole story about Babylon, the Tower of Babel. And we hear in that story that all the various nations, all the various lineages from the sons of Noah after the flood had all gathered together in the same geographic area, the plains of Shinar, which is where the city of Babylon is. And they had worked together to build this tower that then God interrupted their plans, and by confusing their languages, now they begin to disperse and spread out over the earth. And presumably Abraham's family was one of those families that was heading out, leaving this region. And so ethnically, Abraham is not the same people group as the Babylonians, though, all the people of the ancient Near East are related to some extent, right? He's a descendant of Shem. But I don't know. I hope that answers the question, doesn't add more confusion. Somebody asked if I have to offer some live talks in Arabic. Yeah. Actually, we are working on getting some subtitling into Arabic for some of these videos. And in fact, my translator, I'm sure, is on the live stream right now watching this. And he does a fantastic job. I'm looking at doing some content in Arabic, actually, in partnership with some of my friends over in the Middle East. Probably won't be hour-long teachings like this in Arabic at this time, because that's a lot of work. But there will be some Arabic content. I don't know if I'll probably put it on this channel, but I'll put it in a different playlist or whatever, because I know most of the people that are watching me right now are English speakers, but I know there are some who are Arabic speakers, and I do want to have some more content for them in the near future. So, any other questions on the text? It's a really, really cool story. It's one, again, that we can really get into the weeds and speculating more about, the identity. The only of the four phases of the image, the four metals and what they represent, the kingdoms they represent. The only one we know for sure in the text is the first one, which is Nebuchadnezzar. All the rest, we now have to speculate. And you notice how the text doesn't do any speculation for us. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't make any speculation. Daniel doesn't say, and hey, this is what the silver represents. This is what the bronze and the iron. None of that is elaborated on. And so while it can be fun to say, hey, I think, this was maybe the Medes, the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans, and there's great arguments to be made that that's exactly what these different phases or kingdoms could represent. The main, and I think the reason why that's not there is that because the main point is that human kingdoms, there will always be more human kingdoms until the day that there isn't. Things will continue to get crazier and crazier as humanity spirals out of control until God steps in and does something about it. And that God himself is the ultimate solution to human evil, and that when he comes and does it, he's not going to come in the way that you expect. Actually, he's going to come in the opposite way. That's what I think is the significance of the fact that the stone strikes the feet and not the head. You think about Jesus, who gets equated, with the rock that we see in the Hebrew Bible, and how he didn't come in the way that people expected, that he came almost in the opposite way that people expected, came in humility, came as a servant to suffer for the sins of his people, who came and achieved his ultimate victory over sin and death and human evil by actually submitting himself to human evil and to death on a cross. And in that, he actually overcame and had victory. And through dying, he brought us life. In taking on our sin, he brought us forgiveness and atonement. I think those are the things when you start trying to speculate further into the dream. Like, that's the thing that's really worth spending an afternoon on, meditating and just prayerfully, thinking about this and following the example of Daniel, which I think as you enter into these reflections, in your own time with the Lord and the scriptures, as the Spirit speaks to you, is to follow Daniel's example of meditating on all the things that God has done and how amazing those things are. And yet all of those things flow from who he is, from his identity, and beginning in a place of worshiping God, not first for what he's done for you, but worshiping him for who he is. Because of who he is, that's why he's done what he's done. Because of who he is, that's why he's not content to just watch humanity, turn into this big dumpster fire of sin and wickedness and injustice. He can't help himself. He has got to intervene and bring his reign and rule, his justice into the earth. And once he does, there's no going back. And praise God for that, right? So we're well over our hour mark, so I'll cut it off there, and we'll continue on Tuesday at 7 Central in the book of Daniel, chapter 3, which is a fascinating story about these three friends of Daniel. And there's a lot to talk about in that is so relevant to our planet right now and the world that we find ourselves in. And I look forward to doing that in 4 days. So let's just thank the Lord. Father, but we worship you. We worship you for who you are. You are the God who reigns over all, over even human history, God. No matter what rulers and authorities on the earth, whatever power they might have, God, they have it only because you have allowed them to. To you belongs true authority. To you belongs all the kingdoms of the earth, all power, all might, all glory. We thank you, God, that you are so merciful, God, that you took it upon yourself to rescue us from our own mistakes, to rescue us from our own self-destructive and selfish behavior. And we praise you, Father. We praise you for what you have done. We thank you for sending Jesus, for sending the rock to come and be our salvation and to make a place for us to dwell with you, to be with you. What the Chaldeans said should have been right. Like, there's no way, God, that you should have made your dwelling with flesh, and yet you did. You chose to come and tabernacle, to come and make your home, make your dwelling with your people, God. That we would know you, that we would know your presence, that we would learn to recognize your voice. And we praise you and thank you, God, for all of that. And thank you for this wonderful opportunity again to come and sit at your feet, Lord, and read these stories that you have recorded for us in your book, and reflect and meditate and worship you, God, and draw strength and comfort and hope and refreshment, God, from these great reminders of who you are and where all of human history is ultimately headed. All because of you, God. All because of you, Jesus, in whose name we pray. Amen and amen. Thank you all. Blessings upon you. Until next time.